Good morning, everyone. My name is Paulo Arévalo. I'm a research scientist from Boston University, and this talk today is about how at Boston University we're using Google Engine to do land cover and land cover mapping change across multiple decades using Landsat. And so the project that we're part of is the Global Land Cover Mapping and Estimation, or GLANS for short. And this project aims to provide globally consistent but locally relevant maps. And so, complementary to this, we want to characterize uncertainty and changes and trends in ecosystem properties. We want to deliver this as data, science data sets through an LPDAG and through Google Engine. And I'll talk more about that later. And so the basis for this work is the Continuous Change Detection and Classification Algorithm, or CCDC for short, which has been relatively recently implemented on our engine. And so the way that this algorithm works is that it takes all available clear observations from the Landsat, and then it fits harmonic regressions to that data. So the algorithm predicts the next available observation, and when the predicted and the observed values are very different from each other, it flags a change, and then it starts again. And it does that until the very end of the time series. So if you do that for every single pixel everywhere, what we can have is sort of a time machine that can reconstruct easily what's going on the land surface for the period that we're analyzing, which in this case is goes from 1997 to 2019. And so once we do that, we can take the information in these segments, we can take the coefficients, and we can feed that to a classifier and perform a supervised classification. And so with that, we can create maps of land cover or land cover change. And so in this case in particular, if you look at the time series at the bottom, the first part will correspond to trees, then after that there is a break, you have herbaceous cover for a little while, you have shrubs after that, it continues growing, and then you have trees at the very end. If you look at the animation, that's what's going on here. This is in a place in Oregon with forestry operations, and you can see how we're capturing that from this particular patch. And so the other important part of this is the amazing information contained on the Landsat archive. These images here come from a paper that we published earlier this year, where we look at where and when we have clear available observations from Landsat. And what you can see here very quickly is that later on, after the launch of Landsat 8, there's a high number of observations almost anywhere in the world. But earlier on, in the early 2000s and before, we have places with a lot of gaps, especially Northern Africa and Northern South America. And so we did this analysis to try to understand better where the CCDC algorithm will work best and what kind of approaches we need to do to address the places that have gaps in the data. And so as I mentioned before, the core products that we want to provide are maps of land cover and land cover change for the last 20 years. And you see a few examples here of the kind of changes that we're trying to capture. So things like deforestation in the Amazon, construction in certain places and cities, the flooding of a dam here in China. And so the next slides are going to show you a few examples in different continents and the things that we're finding so far and some of the challenges that we're encountering. And so let's start with South America. What you see here are two kind of opposite examples. On top, you see forest recovery happening in the Colombian Amazon. In the bottom, you see forest loss happening in Rondônia in Brazil in the classic pattern of deforestation. And so CCDC captured these kinds of changes quite well. And so we're doing pretty well in this regard. Some other places that are more challenging are especially all the woodlands in Brazil, where we still need to improve our classification. And places in the Pacific coast, cities like Lima and other places that are located in very, very dry places, they can be challenging to map properly. But I think we're doing a pretty good job so far in all the continents where we've done this work. We have overall accuracies of 0.8, so that is a good starting point. If I toggle between these two images, you can see between 2001 and 2019, and you can see very clearly all the forest loss in the Amazon forest, in the south of the Amazon forest. If you switch to North America, on top you see the example that I showed you before, these forestry operations. They have very clear square patterns. The forest is harvested, then it regrows, and you can see that pattern very clearly up here. At the bottom, you see something that is pretty cool. This is a construction of a new airport terminal in Fort Myers in Florida. And you can see very clearly when the terminal comes out, when the runway is built, and later in the time series, when the roads that connect to the main runway appear in the animation. So far, North America is probably the most developed continent that we have so far. We've addressed a lot of the problems here before moving on to different continents. So it's so far it's going pretty well. Moving on to Europe, there's not a lot of major large-scale changes going on in Europe. But I'm showing this example here in Istanbul, and if you look at the animation, you see there is a lot of development toward the west of the city, expansion of the city, and also in the northern part of the city, there's the construction of a highway, and you see all those areas of forest being kind of cut down with a line, with a highway that crosses from one side to the other. Here we have Africa, which is a quite challenging place to map. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the landscape. There's a lot of places with open canopies, shrubs, very dry. And so we see two examples here. One, the one on top, is the construction of the new Cairo, east of Old Cairo. And you can see how all the buildings kind of appear individually over time in this area. And the light colors are even the courtyards in the middle of those buildings. At the bottom, you see the Zambezi River, and you see a little bit of the meandering of the river, and a little bit of alternation between shrubs and trees, which we really don't want. They should be more stable, and so this is one of the challenges that we're trying to address right now. If you look to the west of the continent, you see gaps in the map, and that's places where we don't have enough observations, where there's only good Landsat availability after 2013 when Landsat 8 was launched. And so we will need to find alternatives to fill gaps like those. I don't have maps for Asia or Oceania because we're still working on those before we can share them with you. But I wanted to share this preview of the kind of work that we're doing and what we're trying to get right, which is the change part of these maps. As I mentioned before, we have a few issues. The first one is what we call the flip-flop, which is basically when you have areas that are stable, have stable cover like shrubs, but because of climate variability and because of, let's say, certain things that happen with the change detection algorithm, instead of just having a single land cover class, you get multiple land cover classes over time. CCDC is designed to minimize that happening, but there's sometimes when that occurs. We have some alternatives to deal with that, but it's still an ongoing issue that we're trying to address. Second thing is not so much a problem, it's something that we want to get right, and it's these transitional places, again, where forest is abandoned and it grows, or where you have forestry operations, or where you have slow thinning of the canopy until there's no longer closed canopy. So we're trying to capture those places as good as possible. And finally, which is arguably a more challenging problem, is what we call omission of change. And this is an example where you see a very clearly triangular shape of deforestation. But if you look at the map, we're not getting the entirety of that triangle. And that's because the CCDC algorithm for this particular case couldn't see the change, couldn't see the difference, and our post-processing steps could not capture those properly. We have different algorithms that can correct for that. Unfortunately, it's been really hard to implement them at scale. but we're trying to figure out what we can do about that. And so I focus mostly on the line cover and line cover change part, but that's one of the components of this project. There's other science data sets that we aim to provide. They include change information, but they also include EVI2 median, EVI2 amplitude, EVI rate, and change on EVI year on year. And so an example of EVI amplitude is here for 2010 for North America. And you can see clearly the amplitude correlates with the seasonal patterns that you would expect in a place like North America. For version 2, which we aim to produce next year using Landsat Collection 2, and which we aim to provide from at least mid-90s to 2022, we also want to provide leaf type and leaf phenology, but again, that's coming up in an upcoming release. And as part of this work, we built a handful of tools using Google Earth Engine. Most of them right now are aimed at exploring Landsat time series and testing the CCDC algorithm. And so you can go to this app, you can click anywhere on the world where there's Landsat imagery, and you can see the entire time series of Landsat. You can see how CCDC is working. You can click on the points and load the images on the map. You can use collection 1 or collection 2. You can play with the CCDC parameters to see how that might work in your study area. You can do a lot of things with these apps. We also have a global run of CCDC right now that you can also access through these apps. And if you're interested, this QR code will take you to a YouTube video that was recorded in the Geo for Good Summit this year, where there is a demo of how this works. We expect to provide new apps in this link once we have more maps for the entire world. And so apps that will allow you to sort through the data, to filter through the data, get the changes that you want, and just visualize the data in general. And so the kind of thing that you can see with this app, this is an example here, for a place in Rondonia. I know that in this particular pixel, what happened is that you had forest, there was a disturbance, and after that, there's the yellow segment that is showing all the agricultural cycles with a little more marked seasonality, more complex seasonality. And so if you do that for one pixel, this is what you see. But if you do that for many pixels, then you can make maps of what these segments are telling you. So for example, you can see what is the time of the largest break. And you can see that in this case, this correlates with the history of the change of the landscape. So the oldest changes are kind of close to the roads. The newer changes are closer to where the deforestation frontier is. You can take a look at things like amplitude. So if you look at the red segment, that's going to have a lower amplitude because this is evergreen forest in the Amazon. But after that, and after the establishment of agriculture, there's going to be more marked seasonal amplitudes. And so you can see here in the map very clearly. Or you could take things you could take a look at things like the root mean square error, which correlates with how well the segments are fitting to your data. And sometimes that's important because landscapes that are more stable are going to have lower RMSEs. Landscapes that are more variable and changing will have higher RMSEs, and sometimes that's useful for classification or for detecting things that you might be interested in. And so with that, I thank you. This was a session that was given yesterday, but I invite you to take a look at the links and check the tools. Thank you so much.
I can take questions here. Yeah, so first off, this is awesome. The first question I have, if I can have two. First question I have is, what specific index or band are you running this on, and how does that kind of influence the results of it?
Yeah, and so the question was, what kind of bands or indices is the CCDC algorithm being run on, and how that affects the results? And so right now we're running that on all the spectral bands optical spectral bands from Landsat. We don't run, we are not using any indices to run that global CCDC run. For the change detection part, we're only using the green and the infrareds. The green, the red, and the infrareds, because that's what improves the detection of change and minimizes spurious changes if you include especially the blue band. That said, there's been other projects where people use vegetation indices, especially using the tassel cap transformation is pretty good because it condenses a lot of the information on those spectral bands into just three, and you can see a lot of just running those three bands, so it's also going to be much smaller.
Quick follow on that. How do you merge all the results out of three different bands with one change detection? Like an average time, something like that.
So the question is how do you merge all the change in the different bands into a single measure of change, right? And so CCDC is actually providing the change information for, you get the fits for all of the bands, and there's different ways of dealing with this. So the CCDC implementation is checking for change in all of the bands. The non-air engine version of it, you can tweak that and you can tell it, either tell me a change if it happens in one band, or give me a change if it happens in all the bands at once.
Last question,
Yeah.
if I can. What's like the time frame for persistence of that change, right? So I'm thinking like this is obviously really good at deforestation, which like is a long cycle change. Can this be theoretically run on something like the ones where you have like a few days of change? Is that like enough signal for it to capture that?
Yeah, so the question is how good is this CCDC to capture different types of change, right? Things like flooding that are more short changes versus longer changes. And so I would say that CCDC is pretty good at capturing very marked changes that are sustained for as long as you have enough data to find it. And so, say it in a different way. If you're looking at a place with a very, very high data density, you can find more of those smaller changes than if you're looking at a place with less data density. So that is one thing. Second, if the change is marked enough to be kind of a punctual change, CCDC is pretty good at finding that. If it's a gradual thing, or if it's a change accompanied with seasonality, it's a little more challenging, but we may be able to capture that. So for example, places that are seasonally flooded, they don't show up as changes because there's really no change, but the fits of the harmonic terms correlate perfectly with the seasonality, and you can play with that amplitude and separate what's here and what's here, which will be flooded and not flooded.
Thank you.
Yeah.